This is the Flyerdelphia podcast, presented by SportsTalkPhilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heaning. Hello, Flyers fans, and welcome into another episode of the Flyerdelphia podcast, part of SportsTalkPhilly.com. I'm your host, Kevin Durso, joined once again by Rob Riches and Dan Heaning. So this week, we start to turn the corner on the NHL offseason and look ahead to the 2017-18 season. It is a little bit closer every week, and actually, we are just about a month away, right about a month away, I should say, from preseason hockey games. So now is a good time to start looking in that direction, looking at the team getting back on the ice for the new season. And this week, we're taking a closer look at where the Flyers are as a franchise, because it's a fine line between being a team that has desires and aspirations to win in the here and now, and a team that is rebuilding. So what we're going to do is look at the pros and cons of each side, and then later in the show, discuss why the Flyers are on both sides of that picture. Why are they a rebuilding team, and why should they be a rebuilding team? Why are they a team that has the potential to win now, or compete, at least in terms of playoff picture, as soon as this season, and where that takes them in years down the road. So let's start with the pros and cons of being a rebuilding team. Guys, what do you see as the pros of rebuilding?
When you're rebuilding, when you're basically setting that foundation, you're setting yourself up for further success. You're setting yourself for success in the long term. You're playing, kind of the longer game. You're developing prospects. You're building through the draft. You're not just competing to win maybe for, 1, 2, 3 seasons. You're looking to compete for much longer than that. So, when you're a rebuilding club, you're kind of just getting yourself together. You're getting yourself organized and, getting your younger guys in gear and just kind of seeing how you can compete for a longer term picture, maybe 5, 6, 7 seasons if you're able to swing that. That's definitely one of the big benefits, I think, when it comes to rebuilding.
Well, yeah, definitely what Rob is saying. Long-term talent can breed long-term success, and in every team that wins the Stanley Cup, that is exactly the case. Every Stanley Cup winner builds its team through the draft, through long-term talent. Just take a look at the three-headed dynasties of our time. From 1995 to 2003, New Jersey Devils, Detroit Red Wings, Colorado Avalanche, all built through the draft. They made trades, to get themselves better, put themselves over the top. But the core of those teams, the best players those teams really had, were brought in through the draft. 2009 to 2017, this era, post-lockout, three-headed dynasty, Chicago, Pittsburgh, LA, again, built through the draft. The Chicago Blackhawks, Jonathan Toews and Patrick Kane. Pittsburgh Penguins, Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin. And the LA Kings, you have Anze Kopitar, you have Dustin Brown, you have and then they all made deals to put them over the top. That's probably the biggest pro of rebuilding, is being able to build the skeleton of a Stanley Cup winning team.
Yeah, I'm right there with both you guys. I think the first thing that I can think of when it comes to being a team that's building is that you build the prospect pipeline first and foremost. You start off by building your farm system, building it up to be something that people are talking about as those players get closer to the NHL level. And then when they do reach the NHL level, you're a team that's a force to be reckoned with, because all of these talented players who are young are coming up at the exact same time and working well together as a team. It also creates more depth within your system as well, I would think. You're going to have deeper lineups across the board. Your minor league teams are going to look better. You're going to have junior prospects that look better and are talked about more on a greater scale. That's what we're seeing from the Flyers right now. So I think all of that is really good. You also, especially I think this year, it establishes this a lot more. Knowing that there's spots open for younger players, watching players grow is a very exciting thing. There's an excitement to youth. I think fan bases flock to young players. They get very excited about seeing these players come up and seeing them grow. So those things to me are all very positive and key things when you talk about rebuilding, trying to build through the draft. Yeah, is it fun going through the draft every year as an exciting event, it being the most exciting event? No, it's not. You want to get to the finish line. You want to be a contender. But for a lot of teams, as Dan mentioned, the best way to get there is to build through the draft year after year after year. What are we looking at right now with the Flyers? You go from the year that Travis Sanheim was drafted in 2014, then you go Ivan Provorov, Travis Konechny in 2015, German Rubtsov in 2016, Nolan Patrick, Morgan Frost 2017. First round picks, and then deeper than that, obviously, but those first round picks and the number of them, it just generates all the more excitement around that. And even though, yeah, it's not fun being in a position where you get to draft successfully, it's not fun being in a position to draft an Ivan Provorov or a Nolan Patrick, even if the Nolan Patrick pick came out of luck. But, you know, while that's not a fun situation, it's the only way you can sometimes get out of the hole of being mediocre. And that's the way I see it. Now, do we want to shift the gears and we'll go over to some of the cons of rebuilding? What are some of the things that are negative about being a rebuilding team?
Obviously, when you're putting the fate of your franchise in the hands of a bunch of prospects, there's no guarantee that's going to work. You know, the NHL draft, I mean, on the surface scouting has improved. You know, the scouting this year has improved immensely over the scouting 10 years ago. Scouting 10 years ago is better than scouting 20 years ago. And yeah, those scoutings evolve. There's no exact science. It's still a crapshoot for the most part. You can have prospects that come out and fall right flat on their face. You know, you look at the Flyers 10 years ago, they draft James Van Riemsdyk in what was not exactly penned as the greatest draft out there, but, you know, he's somebody who wasn't exactly the generational talent. I don't know if it's exactly fair to say that he's fallen flat on his face, but yeah, he's carved out a very good career for himself. But, you know, that's just an example. And I think another con is, you know, you have it's just a matter of patience. You have teams that run out of patience. You have fans that run out of patience. You know, nobody wants to see a club that's going out there and just kind of going through the motions just because they're developing prospects every year. You know, you look at the ire crossing sports a little bit here that the hometown Sixers have drawn, you know, just with their process and how they were basically being accused of making a mockery of the game because it's like they weren't even trying out there because that's how heavy their rebuild was. So it's a matter of patience. It's a matter of, you know, just there's no exact science to it. You can have prospects just kind of falling flat on their faces.
Yeah, and to go off what Rob said, the draft is an absolute crapshoot. Not every blue chip prospect is going to develop into a great player. Look at the trials and tribulations that the Edmonton Oilers had to go through. They drafted Nail Yakupov, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, Sam Gagner. Now, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins is the only player still on the team, but he's not even considered that top flight kind of prospect anymore. That rebuild only really got kickstarted when they got Connor McDavid. They had to get that surefire generational talent to push them in the direction that they needed to go. And like Rob said too, like you have to lose a lot to gather all of the necessary players to properly build a team. And what that does, it's just it kills fan interest at every level. Like look at the Arizona Coyotes. Their long-term viability in the desert is questionable at best. Now they might be able to, you know, bear the fruits of their suffering with young players like Max Domi, Clayton Keller, Dylan Strome, but is the damage already done? Is it irreparable to like all these kids are going to come up and start playing well, but they haven't been making money for, you know, a long time there. So is it going to work out, or are they just going to be gone by the time those kids hit their primes?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Rob, I think you hit the nail on the head when it comes to patience, because after so much time, you know, and I think the Flyers have been in a good position over the last few years, if we're going to sit there and call them a rebuilding team over the last few years, given their solid performances in the draft, at least by all accounts. It seems like everybody has praised their draft year after year since Ron Hextall took over as GM. But the thing about it is that I think the Flyers have been okay in this department with the patience kind of thing because of the fact that every now and then you would hit a year. You know, 2013-14, they make the playoffs, even if it was just the 1-7 game series. Then they draft a player who, over the course of time, has drawn a lot of interest and become a popular name in the system. Then they missed the playoffs the following year, 2014-15. They turned that into 2 draft picks that both happened to be on the roster last season. Then 2015-16, you get a playoff run out of it. You get a team contending for a playoff spot, and not only contending for a playoff spot, but after that, they get into the playoffs. They go 6 games into a playoff series with the team that was ranked at the top of the league the whole way through the year. So those things are important too. You've balanced it with these playoff appearances where you kind of have, even though it's not fun to be that inconsistent, 1 year in, 1 year out, that kind of thing, you do have a way to, it kind of alleviates the pressure of it a little bit because of the fact that you did have a team that technically was a contender, because getting into the playoffs still allows you the chance to compete even if you're going up against Goliath, it feels like. That being said, playing the draft game gets boring over the course of time. It gets very tired and it makes people impatient because that's not what teams go out there and play for. They go out there to be what all of those dynasties were over the course of the years, what the Detroit Red Wings were, and what the New Jersey Devils were, and what the Colorado Avalanche were in that time, and what Chicago and Pittsburgh have been able to do in recent years, and LA too. All of those teams. So that's a big part of it. Another thing that I think is a negative is, and we touched on this a little bit a few episodes back, because we've talked about these players individually, we've talked about them collectively, but you're losing out on some of the prime of your other players. You're sitting here while you're waiting for all of these players to come up, and yes, you've got a lot of talent in the system. No one is arguing that. But you also have guys like Claude Giroux, Jake Voracek, and Wayne Simmons that are sitting here, and where is it all going for them? They've given a lot of time in their careers to try to win with the Flyers, and it just hasn't been there because pretty much they've been on their own for most of this. And even though, now there may be some youth coming that could help, like we said, you don't know that every prospect is going to be a hit. You may have a few that are close, but the NHL is a whole different animal. Look at the way that we still can talk about Scott Lawton and the fact that, this is a guy who got drafted 6 years ago. And now we're still talking about him as is he an NHL player or not? We're still looking at him as this make-or-break player. He's going to have a make-or-break year eventually. He just got re-signed, so that's a bonus to him. He has some time to stick around the organization. But you look at that and you go, how much longer before you turn around and you say that's a first-round pick that didn't work out for them the way that they would have expected? That's what happens with draft picks over the course of time. So the patience factor is definitely a big one, and then looking at the prime of other players and seeing that slowly pass you by is another big thing.
I would like to add, though, if you can do a rebuild and you can do it quickly, kind of like what Toronto did, you can still take advantage of those primes. Like, Toronto now seems to be like a team that has gone from pretender to contender. Like, they even got Patrick Marleau to jump ship from San Jose to Toronto. So, as long as you get the talent and they're ready to make the leap, you can still go out there and try to compete at that level. You don't always have to lose the prime of your best players just because you're rebuilding. It's just you got to wait for that generational talent like an Austin Matthews to get there.
Well, let's not forget, Toronto's also got their brain trust has got Lou Lamoriello and Mike Babcock behind the bench. These are two proven winners. These guys know a thing or two about what it takes to get to that next step, get to that next level, and compete.
Yeah, and I think, Dan, to your point, it's kind of a perfect segue in a way because of the fact that a move for Toronto like Patrick Marleau fits what they were able to do last season. Last season, they are the upstart team. Austin Matthews is the biggest thing, one of the biggest things in hockey at that time, and will be for years to come. No question about it. He is the generational talent that will drive that team, but it does start to attract the veteran names that see the potential of going, if I was on that team, I could help maybe get them over the top. And that's kind of what we're going to segue into, because now that we've looked at both sides of being a rebuilding team, next we're going to look at the sides of being a team trying to win now. So we'll look at that up next on the Flyerdelphia podcast. Stay with us. You're listening to the Flyerdelphia podcast with Kevin, Rob, and Dan on SportsTalkPhilly.com. And back here on the Flyerdelphia podcast, and as we mentioned at the top of the show, the Flyers are really riding a fine line between being a team with the potential to win now and compete effective immediately, and still being in the rebuilding stages. So after looking closer at the rebuilding side, we're now going to look at the win now side and do the same thing, pros and cons. So guys, what do you have as the pros for winning now? Rob, you want to lead us off?
Yeah, I think the pros of winning now, obviously, that's where you're putting yourself in the best position to hoist Lord Stanley's Cup at the end of the season. You know, it's one of if you can win now, obviously that's the ultimate goal. You know, every kid playing on frozen ponds, playing on streets across Canada, the United States, you know, they're not doing it because, you know, maybe one day my team will be able to fight for a top pick. You know, they do that because they want to be able to crack the NHL. They want to be able to lift the Stanley Cup one day. It's basically a childhood dream, I guess you can go ahead and call it. And that's something where, you know, when you're winning now, you have that chance. You know, you can go ahead and hoist the cup. You're putting yourself in the best position to be able to do that. It may not be the most sustainable outcome, but at the end of the day, what people care about is champions. They care about who's lifting that cup at the end of the season. They care who's getting their name etched onto it. That's really what matters at the end of the day.
Every team that wins the Stanley Cup is in win now mode. Nobody wins when they're rebuilding, because you can go from rebuilding to win now just like that. Just like like I mentioned in the prior segment, Toronto went from rebuilding to win now within a season because they were adding at the deadline. And look at the Flyers back in the 90s and in the 2000 era with the Lindros and Richards eras. They were in win now mode throughout that entire time. And they were always in the playoffs, and they were going on deep runs, trying to make it to the Stanley Cup final. They did it once with each player as captain. So you always feel like you're in it. You always feel like, all right, this is the year. This is the year. Now, with those eras, you had quite a few amount of first round exits, but you had those deep runs. So you had that hope, whether as opposed to rebuilding, where you don't have that hope. You have to hope for further on down the line.
Yeah, winning now would mean, as we've talked about, it would mean consistency. And, you know, for a good stretch of time, the Flyers were as consistent as it gets. You know, maybe hold for the run that the Detroit Red Wings were on that just came to an end this past season, where the Flyers were in the playoffs pretty much every year. It was a given from the beginning of the season, and then April would come, and sure enough, they would be right there where everybody thought they were going to be. The thing about it is that notably, going off of where the Flyers are at the moment and thinking about that, competing to get into the playoffs is exciting too. Nobody wants to be watching hockey in March and have in the back of their mind that one mistake is going to be the reason the Flyers didn't make the playoffs and make the last 12, 14, 15 games completely worthless and unmeaningful. You know, that's where the Flyers have been in the last few years. One mistake could be one mistake by yourself could be what sinks you. One mistake by the opposition could be what puts you into the playoff picture. And it's too fine of a line to be riding, quite honestly. Like we talked about, they're riding a line between being a team that goes for it and being a team that does not. I think that one of the things to point out is go back to 2010 when the Flyers were really not they weren't in win now mode per se when they went on that Stanley Cup run. You know, it's a team that barely cracked the playoffs. They made it on the final day of the season, and when a little magic happens too, that's why everybody tells you just get in first and foremost. Just make it there and see what happens. So that's the first thing of it. Getting to the playoffs is an exciting endeavor in and of itself. And then playoff experience for teams that are younger, for teams that are just coming out of that rebuilding stage. Again, look at Toronto. You think playing a series against Washington like they just did this past April isn't going to be valuable for that team? It's immensely valuable. You know, it's great that in his rookie season, Austin Matthews got a chance to play a playoff series. And same goes for all the other guys, for Mitch Marner, and then adding the other guys that they will as time goes on. You know, getting the experience is valuable because the season is such a grind anyway. You realize that it's a whole different level once you make it past the 82-game regular season. It's even more of a grind in the playoffs than it is during the regular season. And success in the NHL in general should be motivating. If you get close enough after a while, Toronto Toronto was in overtime looking at a chance to force a Game 7, and they do lose. But, you're sitting here going, how close, you're sitting here going, how close were they to making it to the next round? That little taste of it makes you want to go a little bit harder, get it next time, I feel this, and I don't consider them a rebuilding team or necessarily a win now team. They weren't considered a top contender, and they're far from a rebuilding team. But look at Ottawa. Ottawa goes into a Game 7 against Pittsburgh in the conference final and has to play into double overtime. Again, it's a grind. It's grueling. And one goal that goes one way or the other is the difference between them playing for the Stanley Cup and Pittsburgh playing for the Stanley Cup. That's motivating. So those are all things that stand out to me. And then to factor in the young players that are coming into the picture. Young players thriving early in their career sets the stage for bigger things later. So that's kind of why you're pulling, and fans should be pulling a little bit towards that win now side a little bit more now that players are going to start filling the lineup. There's going to be growing pains. It's going to happen. But at the same time, a little bit of success early sets the stage for bigger things as those players develop and grow. And imagine if the Flyers made the playoffs this upcoming season with the blue line that they're going to have, knowing it's going to consist of among players who have, I don't want to call it limited experience, but it's crazy that we're calling Shane Gostisbehere a veteran on the blue line when he's going into his third season. When you factor in Ivan Provorov and probably the additions of among two out of Sam Moran, Robert Haig, Travis Sanheim, those guys all factoring into the picture possibly somehow, and then go to the forwards, Oscar Lindblom, and Nolan Patrick, and Travis Konechny, and a whole host of others, really. I mean, there's a lot that you could add in. So success for those young players just sets the stage for something bigger going down the stretch and going in the years to come. Now, what about the cons to winning now and the win now side of things? Rob, you want to take that?
Yeah, when it comes down to it, winning now, obviously there's a lot of allure. Like I mentioned, everybody wants to be the champion. Everybody cares about the champion. But when it comes down to it, there are a lot of ways as a franchise for you to kind of shoot yourself in the foot doing that, whether it's getting rid of these younger draft picks or getting rid of these younger prospects to bring in somebody who you think could push your team over the edge, and you end up falling short. At the end of the day, you're losing it. You do get that progress in the playoffs while you are getting there. You're still losing out on guys who could help your club out for the future, or guys who could fall flat on their face because, as we mentioned, the draft is a crapshoot. But when it comes down to it, the Flyers throughout much of their history have been a win now franchise. I wish I could want something in my life as much as the late great Ed Snider wanted a third Stanley Cup. They were relentless in that pursuit, and they ended up kind of slipping up a little bit a long ways just because they ended up coming short all those times. And, it ends up turning into a thing where, you really want to compete now. You think you find that piece. That's how you end up signing a genius goaltender to a 9-year, $51 million contract. That's how you end up signing aging Vinny Lecavalier for 5 years because you think these are guys you could put your club over the top, but it really just doesn't get you anywhere at the end of the day.
Why do you have to be mad, Rob? Have to bring that contract into the picture?
Just leads to organizational short-sightedness, I guess you can call it.
No, that's very true. Dan, what do you have?
Well, the biggest con for me in terms of win now is that you sacrifice the future. You sacrifice long-term winning for short-term winning. There's no better example in my eyes than the 1994 New York Rangers. They traded a bunch of young talent away, like Doug Weight, Tony Amani. They won the Cup that year. But then once the guys like Messier and Graves and Leach began to decline, they missed 7 straight playoffs. They missed the postseason 7 straight years. But if you're going to go for it right now, you have to also have a long-term plan. Ideally, the best way to build a team is to rebuild and then go into a win-now situation and then maintain that win-now situation like the Detroit Red Wings did with great drafting and superior scouting. But then you also have teams like right now, like Chicago, LA, and Pittsburgh. Like, they're the three-headed monster that I said from before. They're going to be in trouble. LA's already in trouble. Chicago is getting into trouble, and Pittsburgh's going to be the last one into trouble, but they're going to be in trouble. Because once their best players start declining, so are they. Because they're going to be stuck with those large cap hits. They're going to be stuck with players that aren't producing the same way, and there's going to be no place to throw them. It's similar to the way New Jersey and Colorado started to decline when their best players started to age, because Father Time is undefeated. The only exception is, as I said before, Detroit. So if you want to win now, you still have to have that long-term plan in mind, and that's exactly what Paul Holmgren didn't have when he went for it. There's no doubt in my mind that he went for it from the time of like 2008 to about 2012. He was going for it. He wanted to win the Stanley Cup. That was a group of players that he thought could win right now, and he sacrificed everything they had, and that's why the Flyers right now are probably in their worst span of play since the early 90s, because there was no plan. He hedged bets on guys like Pronger, on Briere, on Tiemann, on Yager, and didn't hedge bets on young players. I mean, he had Giroux, but Giroux was kind of more of an exception than the rule.
Yeah, and I think you touched on it, Dan, with one of the things I have written down for this: how quickly trying to win now can turn into another year of rebuilding or retooling. It can go both ways so quickly, especially with the things that are unpredictable in the game, like injuries and things like you talk about Chris Pronger being a move that Paul Holmgren makes to try to win now and get the defenseman that puts him over the top. And yes, you know what? The first year Pronger was in Philadelphia, it did make a big difference. But then what happens in year two? All of a sudden, here comes the injury that ultimately ends up being a career-ending injury for him, things like that. And you can't plan for that, but you made a big move to try to get that, and it didn't end up really working out in the long run, because while you did make a Stanley Cup final appearance with Pronger, you didn't get the full remainder of his career out of him. It's not to say that he wasn't possibly on the decline slightly already, but you'll never know. It happens so quickly, and then it actually really, that kind of whole instance really started the thing spiraling out of control, because between the Pronger career-ending injury and Brizgalov not being what he was supposed to be when he was signed that long-term contract, you thought you would, you're thinking a quick move, waving some dollars around, was going to solve all your problems on the blue line and in goal. And it turns out that's the complete opposite. It puts you in a situation where you're back to square one, starting over. At this point in time now, the Flyers are going to have to find a way to get back into that spot where it's contention. I agree with you, Dan. I think this is probably the worst stretch that the Flyers have had in that long span of time, since the early 90s, since right before everything, probably since right before the Leclerc-Desjardins trade. That's probably when it turned in the right direction for them. And, maybe that's why there was such a big jubilation around the fact that the Flyers were getting the number 2 pick this year. When something falls into your lap, or when something seems like it's too good to be true, the way that the success of that trade for the Flyers was in the 90s, the way Leclerc just took off and became a superstar, the way Desjardins became the reliable blue liner, that basically just led the way along the Flyers blue line for so many years in the 90s and into the 2000s as well. But you look at that and you go, every now and then there needs to be that player that comes into the picture that makes you go, that's the guy who's going to be around when it all turns around. I think people felt that with a Nolan Patrick. And granted, when it was the number 2 pick, there was no clue. Nobody had any idea who was going to be available with the second pick. There was going to be somebody else who picked beforehand. And so it could have been Nolan Patrick, it could have been Nico Hischier. One way or the other, the Flyers were getting this player who was projected to be in the top 2 by sheer luck, and it's something that happens that makes everybody think this might be the turning point. Now, that being said, being in the position the Flyers are now is certainly a negative when it comes to looking towards being a playoff team, because making the playoffs alters your draft position. The Flyers aren't in the position they are in the draft this past offseason if they make the playoffs. It doesn't happen. There's no lottery talk. There's none of that. So then in that case, there's no Nolan Patrick either. So at the same time, look, nobody wants to be the team that has the expectation of being a one-and-done team. All the credit in the world to what Toronto did over the past season. But truth be told, they went in with the same expectation facing Washington that the Flyers did the year before. That it was still going to be the team that, all right, it was a nice run. You got up against the top team in the league the past year. You're going to end up being out in a matter of days, but at least you can say you made the playoffs. That's never fun, but you have to start somewhere, and that's probably the best place for the Flyers to have started a couple years ago. Now, unfortunately, last season felt like more of a step backwards, and that's why I think you started to see early on at least a little bit of changes in this offseason about moving towards the future a little bit more. Let's get out of that rebuilding method, because I don't think the Flyers really, after this past season, knew what kind of identity they were going to take, and now they can kind of be that team that spent the offseason retooling, looking deep within the farm system to find prospects that are ready to go or close to ready, and figuring out a way to get them into the lineup. I think that's why they did it the way they did. So now that we've looked at both sides and the pros and cons to each, which one are the Flyers currently closer to taking? Are they closer to being a rebuilding team or a team that wins now? We'll take a closer look at both sides of that when we come back here on the Flyerdelphia podcast.
You're listening to the Flyerdelphia podcast with Kevin, Rob, and Dan on SportsTalkPhilly.com.
Back here on the Flyerdelphia podcast, and lately it's been easy to look at the Flyers and see a team rebuilding, but it also hasn't been given a pair of playoff appearances in the last 4 seasons that make them seem more like a consistent bubble team than a rebuilding team. So, guys, give me your take on this. Are the Flyers a rebuilding team?
Absolutely. I think when you look at the Flyers, that's the first word that comes to my mind, at least, is rebuilding. You have a team that is very focused, very predominant on their young stars. You think of guys like Gostisbehere, Provorov, Konechny, guys who have all, made that step in past seasons. Oscar Lindblom getting ready to join the fray this year. Travis Sanheim, Sam Moran, Robert Haig also expected to battle for a spot in training camp. You have these young guys who are, make no mistake, the future of the Philadelphia Flyers. And that was 2 seasons ago when Gostisbehere was in the middle of his history-making rookie season, and last year when you got to watch guys like Provorov and Konechny battling it out on a nightly basis, you're pretty much taking a look at the Flyers rebuild in action. You're looking at these guys who are expected to shoulder the weight of the franchise within the next few seasons, and guys who, younger talents who are, just getting ready to take that step and make that climb, and just kind of getting to see how they adjust to the rigors of the game at the NHL level, and seeing what they can work on, seeing what's going to need to be improved in their games. And, so I think that you're getting these guys, it's still a franchise that's rebuilding. And I've said this, the Flyers did have a playoff appearance in 2016, and all you have to do is win and you have a chance. But I don't think it's so much the Flyers made the playoffs in 2016. I think it's more the Flyers fell, I guess you can call it, bass backwards into a playoff spot in 2016. It's something where they kind of had everything coming up their way. They managed to get in. And, if you can make the playoffs, absolutely go for it if it's there. You never know what's going to happen in the Stanley Cup playoffs. But for the most part, absolutely, this is a rebuilding club.
Rob, I want to follow up with you on something really quick with that then, because I like the term you used for this past season, rebuilding in action. Does that make it a little easier to take the fact that they're a rebuilding team?
Absolutely. You have that tangible progress in seeing how these young guys can adjust to the game at the top level.
Dan, what about you?
There's no question that the Flyers are in rebuild mode. You can just tell by how Ron Hextall is attacking every season with his trades. They're usually selling. They're not really bringing in players. I know they brought in Valtteri Filppula at the trade deadline this past season, but that was an exception rather than a rule. The Flyers are a team right now that are in desperate need for the cavalry to show up. They need guys like Ivan Provorov to instantly become their number one defenseman, as he did last season. They need guys like Shane Gostisbehere to come in and become an immediate power play weapon, as he did the last 2 seasons. They need guys at forward to do the same thing, to assume top 6 roles, to get bang for your buck production, and then they need the same thing with goaltending. They need a goaltender to emerge to become that number 1 type goaltender, because in every single aspect of the game, they don't have the guys right now. They've proven that over the last 5 seasons that they are not good enough to get them to the position of being a win now team. Not even a reloading team, which I don't think actually exists, because in order to reload, you still have to try and go to win. Transition is just another way of saying you're rebuilding. You're just planning on winning for another year. Maybe not this year. Hey, if we make the playoffs this year and we do okay, that's great. But if you're always gunning to make the playoffs regardless. But sometimes you're above expectation when you're doing that. And for 2016, that's exactly what the Flyers were. They weren't supposed to make the playoffs that year. Boston and Detroit were having a race to the bottom, and Boston won, missed the playoffs, and that's really how the Flyers made the playoffs. They went on a nice little run. Two teams were terrible at that time, and they were able to jump past one.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of prospects and getting younger, absolutely, this is a rebuilding team. Yeah, and another factor of that is you don't just open up a roster spot, or several roster spots, I should say, for prospects and openly admit that and not have people think that this is a team that's setting its sights on the future. It's just the way it is. As soon as you open it up and admit to it, we're bringing kids in to start seeing how they look. Well, then you can't be called a win now team in that respect, because you need everything to fall into place so quickly for that to happen. Now, depending on how good these players are early on, could determine the true path of the team next season, or it could speed up the process, but it is a process, especially in hockey. Developing young leaders takes time. Developing quality defensemen takes time. Developing a number one goalie takes a lot of time, as we've seen. So to me, the Flyers are closing in on the rebuilding process being complete. We said earlier, go back four draft years to Ron Hextall's first draft. That's when the Flyers selected Travis Sanheim. They have 2 of their 2015 picks already up. As Rob said, it's rebuilding in action to see Ivan Provorov and Travis Konechny playing in the NHL almost immediately. It really is. And then there's, you constantly look at these players who could be joining. Their top pick from the 2017 draft could make the roster. There's potential for even more than that as we go through everything. And as these players make the transition to the NHL, yes, there will be growing pains. And that's part of the reason why you can still call it rebuilding, because truth be told, these players are growing right in front of your eyes as they play at the game's highest level. But these are also the players that will dictate if the Flyers have success in the near future. So while it's still rebuilding, it's not far off from being a win-now team, which is why I've constantly called it throughout the show. I've constantly called it. They're riding a fine line between the two sides. Because, look like what we talked about with making the playoffs 2 seasons ago. You can find your way in there by just falling in by luck, by watching other teams have struggles at the time that you have enough success to move into a spot to get into a playoff series and get into the playoffs. That being said, there's going to have to come a time when the Flyers are that team that is top 4 in the conference again to be determined a top contender again. Remember the years, and this is kind of like that late 90s, early 2000s kind of thing, when the Flyers not only, and we even said, some years that maybe amounted to 1 playoff series and they were out of the playoffs. Other years, it would amount to a little bit of a run. One way or the other, though, every time you turn around, the Flyers were a team that was finishing towards the top of their division and coming away with one of the top 4 spots in the conference, to the point where they were hosting a first-round series. That makes a big difference. That's where the team needs to strive to get to eventually. It's not going to happen next year. Their sights are going to be set on the same thing they were this past season, the season before, and really, in the season before that they just missed out on. 2 out of the 3 years we're talking here, they just missed out on getting into the playoffs in some capacity. In those years that they missed the playoffs, they weren't ridiculously far out of the playoff picture. Especially last season. Last season they were really hanging in there, kind of defying the odds, so to speak, of how long they were actually still considered really part of the discussion, when everybody who closely followed the team knew it wasn't really going to happen. But the standings showed a different picture, is what I'm trying to say. They were technically still right there as the calendar really turned towards April almost, but reality was a different story. You ask any Flyers fan what was the moment that it was definite that they were not going to have any magic in the stretch run. It was when the bounce goes against them in Boston, or something like that. things like that, and those games happened when? Beginning of March? So over a month before the season was over, you could tell where it was heading. That's the difference. You want to be a team eventually that there's no doubt where you end up. There's no doubt where you belong in the playoff picture. And it does take time to get there. So for now, it's just about seeing where they are, and it is rebuilding in action. It's going to be even more, to steal Rob's term just a little bit there, but it's going to be rebuilding in action on a greater level this upcoming season when it's not just Provorov and Konechny and even Gostisbehere in just his third season in the NHL. Now it's going to be how many forwards, how many new defensemen. You're setting yourself up for the potential of 4 to 5 rookies on this team, not to mention the 2 that are in their second year, or the 1 that's in his third year, and the others that have been kind of brought into the picture that weren't draft picks, but still categorized as these players who have less than 3 years of NHL experience.
Well, this is also a new thing for the Flyers. They don't rebuild at all. Like, maybe in the beginning of the franchise's history they were rebuilding, because you have to, because you're not rebuilding, you're just building. But this is a brand new thing for Flyers fans to experience, almost for the organization to experience. So you have to have that level of, experimentation, of patience, of seeing where these players are going to go, seeing what Sam Moran can do, seeing what Robert Hagg can do, seeing what Travis Sanheim can do. You have to be able to just be able to feel it out and have, patience in what these guys can do. And if they don't work out, that's why it's rebuilding, because you can always just go back to the draft or go to another prospect and see what they can do if somebody doesn't work out.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you know what? I mean, that's what's going to be determined down the stretch, down the next few years. That's the path. Where does it go from here? And that's actually something that we'll probably talk about coming right up, actually. When we come back, we will wrap things up by looking at when the Flyers should be expected to be a major contender again, and if their chance at being in the playoffs should come as soon as this upcoming season. So with that, we'll be right back here on the Flyerdelphia podcast.
You're listening to the Flyerdelphia podcast with Kevin, Rob, and Dan on SportsTalkPhilly.com.
Back here on the Flyerdelphia podcast, and so obviously the long-term goal for the Flyers is to become a Stanley Cup contender, as it is for all teams in the NHL. But given their depth in terms of prospects, and how they've handled a rebuilding process and retooling process over the last few years, trying to build up that pipeline as we talked about, and how several of those prospects are trending upward at this time, when will this team be able to focus on winning in the here and now as a top contender to win it all? Does that happen, so to speak, as soon as this season? When could they make a playoff run this season? Or does it start to really take shape in the years down the road when they're not just going in as maybe the one-and-done playoff team? And how many years out are we talking for that? So go ahead, guys. What do you have for that? Rob, you want to lead us off again?
Well, let's take a look at the rest of the Eastern Conference here. When it comes to at least the Atlantic Division, your surefire win-now teams are teams like Montreal, teams like Ottawa, and as we mentioned earlier, Toronto, who's kind of taken that step, and you have Tampa Bay, who's kind of retooling. And guys, clubs that are more or less rebuilding are Buffalo and Boston, and I have a third category. I'll get to that in a second. And in the Metro Division, you have Washington, Pittsburgh, Blue Jackets, and Rangers, who are all teams that are looking to win now, that are looking to take that next step. And you have teams like the Flyers, teams like New Jersey and Carolina, who are on that fast track. They may not be ready to win anything right now, but they will be within the next few seasons. And of course, there's the Islanders, who I have grouped in with the Florida Panthers and the Detroit Red Wings in a third category called "What the hell is going on here?" territory. That's just one of those things where nobody really knows what's going on there. They're all just completely screwed at this point. I award them no points, and may God have mercy on their respective souls. But so when it comes down to it, when you have those teams like the Capitals, Penguins, Blue Jackets, and Rangers, who are kind of the win-now teams of the Metro Division, there's no immediate need for the Flyers to kind of step in and be a fifth team there. Within the next few seasons, Washington's window is going to slam shut. It may not seem like it anytime soon, but the Penguins' window is going to slam shut, and the Blue Jackets, it might take them a little bit longer, but their window is eventually going to close as well. And the Rangers, they're one of those teams where when you think their window is going to shut, something just kind of finds its way to pry back open. In this case, last year, it was the acquisition of Jimmy Vesey. But, when it comes down to it, the Flyers, there's just no immediate need for them to win right now. It's not something they necessarily have to do. Let's see what else the prospects can do when they come up. Let's see how this rebuild in action goes. And within 2-3 seasons or so, when some of those windows start shutting, they'll be ready. They'll be ready to take that step and start winning now and start going on deeper playoff runs and start hosting first rounds of the playoffs.
My initial reaction to this is maybe 2020 is when the Flyers will really start being in that position that Rob just mentioned, where they're competing for that 4th seed, that 3rd seed. Well, they're not. It's not like that anymore. But fighting for that home ice advantage. But in the same regard, at 2020, Claude Giroux isn't getting any younger. Neither is Wayne Simmons, and his contract will be up by that time. And Jake Voracek's not getting any younger. So will these players, will the veterans and the young players ever meet on the same highway and actually be able to click and form a team that could actually compete? Because it seems like 2020 is a little bit too further down the line for Giroux, Simmons, and Voracek to actually be that type of player that can, push the team ahead while the young players kind of develop, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. So to me, there's an actual timeline for this, so to speak. This season coming up is another in-between year. They may be a playoff team, they may not. But ultimately, it's going to be a year of growth for several young players. I mean, to me, I call it that in-between year because, if you look at the playoff picture last year, the Flyers ended up missing the playoffs by 7 points in the standings. Now, it seems like a lot. It isn't in reality. It's a couple games going one way or the other in some cases. And I look at how close together a lot of these other teams were. Toronto also got the benefit of the overtime point quite a bit. The Flyers won 39 games, 32 regulation overtime. So they actually, for 1 year, the Flyers rarely were the team with the shootout success. Now, Toronto had 39 regulation overtime wins, but only 40 wins in general. Bottom line is whether you want to sit there and play the shootout point or not, in terms of that, the Flyers were 1 win behind the team that actually made the playoffs in that segment, in that wild card spot. The problem is that, given the fact that, Toronto lost 6 fewer games in regulation than the Flyers did. That's the bottom line of it. It doesn't, there's no other way to put it. So the Flyers need to be that team. And to me, the Flyers are in this spot right now where anything could happen. Look at the way that the Flyers got off during December, that winning streak and things like that. And they were playing at a level that rivaled Washington, Pittsburgh, and Columbus at the time without maybe having the expectations or the roster to really do it. In this case, and the thing is too, you look at the 2 divisions and you can kind of pull, 4 from each side that you can think of that would be in that range of legitimate contenders, and then similarly, there's a few others that you can call the bubble teams, kind of like your Tampa, your Carolina certainly improved over the years. New Jersey and Buffalo are going to be better given what they've done in the draft in recent years. So teams like that, that were, a couple of them that were significantly worse than the Flyers were. You look at where Buffalo and Detroit finished, or Buffalo and New Jersey, finished compared to the Flyers, and it was obviously a completely different story. That being said, the Flyers need to next year be that playoff bubble team that has some good success with younger players. The 2018-19 season, to me, year 2 of so many of these players, needs to be close to, and especially if you still have a veteran core like Giroux, Voracek, and Simmons around, that year needs to be a guaranteed playoff year. And I'm not saying guaranteed in the sense that you come out at the beginning and say it. You need to try to find a way to comfortably squeeze into the playoffs that year and not be watching the standings the way that the Flyers had to over the last couple of times they've made the playoffs. They may not be the top team in the Metro that year, but they do need to comfortably make it and maybe even be more of a player in a series to really put the right amount of confidence in this team moving forward. And then from there, the 2019-2020 season is really going to be the big one because it's 3 years out. when things should really start to be taking shape. Now, obviously, when we just kind of talked about this, success in the league is going to be dictated by where the rest of the teams in the league are and in the conference are, compared to that. But the Flyers are in a position to add in ways that other teams that are regular season contenders cannot, unless, the teams that are regular contenders, Washington, Pittsburgh, among the likes of those, don't add the way the Flyers have been adding in recent years. You don't get to build through the draft at that time because you're typically either sending your draft picks for the veteran player who you think is going to put you over the top, being in that win-now mode that they can be in, or you trade out of that draft pick later on because you find a reason to pick somebody up at the draft instead of the trade deadline. It works both ways for these teams that are in a win-now position. So that being said, the Flyers are going to continually be adding over the next couple of seasons and continue to utilize young players, while other teams may not have that kind of depth in their farm system to be able to pull like that.
Do you think, like you said, they should make the playoffs comfortably, like at least, vie for a playoff spot comfortably? Do you think with a team that is going to have 2 sophomores and a rookie, because they're probably not going to re-sign Brandon Manning, so they'll probably bring in whoever doesn't make it out of the top 3, Moran, Sanheim, and Hag. So they'll have a junior, they'll have 2 sophomores, and they'll have a rookie playing in on defense, and then couple that with Neuvert and Elliott. Is that really a recipe for comfortably making the playoffs?
Well, by that point, see, I'm not going to next year. I'm going the year after with that. So by the next,
so 1920 then.
Well, no, the next season's going to be 17-18, and then 18-19, 2 years out, you'll have Provorov in year 3. Gostisbehere in year 4, and then hopefully 2 rookies in year 2, and then potentially the other 2 that are coming up as rookies would be, Gudas will still be under contract, McDonald will still be under contract, but depending on how you navigate that, you could fit a Sanheim in there as the rookie that year, or Myers in there as the rookie that year. Really depends on how it looks. But that's the year to me, because that's also the year where you have to pay close attention to what you decide to do with some of these defensive prospects. Because eventually, thinking out loud about it, you sit there and you tend to forget that in due time, you're going to still have Gudas and McDonald still being part of the roster, still being part of the salary cap that this team is working with. And you're going to have 2 other defensive prospects who don't make the team this upcoming season, who are still going to be in the picture. So when do you clear a spot, possibly, whether it's using one of the defensive prospects to make a trade, like say you trade a guy like Hag because you need to open up a spot for Sanheim, and you can't trade because you feel like they're not movable because of the contract. You can't move a McDonald, or you can't move a Gudas, let's say. If that happens, what do you parlay it into? Do you take that defensive player and parlay it into a forward that helps you be a little bit more of a contender, that works well with your top line or your second line or something like that? That's why it's unpredictable. I think I'm saying that more as a safety, not safety mechanism, but kind of like a reasonable timeline. If you're going to be a team that feels like you're going to be good this upcoming season, even with all the changes you're making, then if that's the case and you either make the playoffs or come very close to making the playoffs, then the year after should be a playoff year, one way or the other. And then the year after that, 3 years down the road, 2 more seasons in the books for all of these younger players, things like that, that should be a really big year. That should be a year, especially given what other teams in the division should be starting to deal with at that time. It should start to even out, and the Flyers should be emerging as one of the top teams by that point, I would think. I agree with you guys both, by thinking that 2020 is a legitimate time to be thinking about it, to be thinking about being back in that group of teams. You can't call them an elite team now. You won't be able to call them an elite team next year, but 3 years down the road, will they be close? I don't picture, to me, what defines being an elite team, too. I would think making a bit of a playoff run would start to shape that definition a little bit. I don't consider Ottawa a team that's elite by any stretch, but last year they were one of the Final Four and came, like I said, Game 7 double overtime against the team that eventually, the defending Stanley Cup champion and the team that went on to repeat as Stanley Cup champions. That makes you a pretty decent contender in my eyes, So you kind of have to work and see how it goes over the course of the time and see where you're able to progress. Making a playoff appearance as early as next season is valuable experience, but it's not everything. The year after, it's going to have to start being everything, because if they don't make the playoffs next season, it will be, at that point in time, you're talking 4 in 6 that they haven't made the playoffs, including, at that point, 2 in a row, 3 of the last 4. That's going to be something that fans are not going to be able to tolerate well. They'll have an understanding for it if it's a lot of younger players, but you better be ready to go the following year at that point. The excuses are out the window at that point.
There's also a radical shift between 18-19 and 19-20. When there's a ton of players that are going to be unrestricted free agents or just up for free agency, they're not going to have a goaltender under contract. Laterra is going to be up. Simmons is going to be up. Raffl's going to be up. Wheel's going to be up. So it might be at that time and that's the perfect time to buy out McDonald as well. So there's a lot of opportunity there to just kind of, set sail on some of these on that team, on that core of players, and just kind of gear more towards the young players. So it could just be a complete total reset at the start of the 1920 season as well.
Yeah, that's totally fair as well. I agree with you guys. I think that, Dan, you're right. That's a very crucial time because, one thing I noticed looking at the cap situation the Flyers have right now too is that the offseason between the offseason next year, so after the 2017-18 season, really isn't that dramatic of one for them. A lot of the contracts that are expiring are predictably going to be let go at the end of that season. I don't feel like there's anybody who is really they desperately need to re-sign unless they're their own restricted free agents. I think any of the unrestricted free agents from this season into next are going to be guys that you feel like you can afford to let walk. So, especially if you're going to continue this trend of opening up, looking what they're doing this offseason, opening up roster spots so kids can find a way to make it in. So that's the thing. Eventually you're going to put yourself in that kind of position, and being that next offseason isn't crucial in terms of being big spenders or having a lot to do with that, I think the following offseason is going to be very crucial given the number of free agents that they're going to have. So guys, any final thoughts before we wrap things up?
I would like to just say, because we are talking about win now is not always glamorous. We mentioned that in the cons. Win now has not been kind to the Flyers. It didn't go well in the mid '90s. Didn't go well in the 2000s. It's all about having a plan. It's all about seeing that plan through. And for a lot of times during the Clark and Holmgren eras, it didn't really seem that they had plans. It was always just like, no, we just got to go and win the cup now. No, we just got to do that. Now there seems to be a plan with Hextall, and sometimes you have to sit there and you have to be patient and you have to wait that out. Even if you have to have another season where the Flyers don't make the playoffs, even if you have another 2 seasons where the Flyers don't make the playoffs. So it's not fun to be in a rebuild. It's always more fun for a fan to be in a win now, but the payoff is significantly better if you're a rebuilding team, because you have the potential to become a dynasty. You never have the potential to be a dynasty if you build by being a win-now team.
I think when it comes down to it, when you look at how much of the Flyers' history has been spent as a win-now club, when it comes down to it, the biggest thing that let them be able to do that was the lack of a salary cap all those years up until the 05-06 season, where you had the ownership who was willing to cut the checks necessary to bring in the best talent that they could, but then with the salary cap, it's not exactly as easy, and you had the Flyers who are still willing to spend to the cap if they have to spend to the cap. Obviously, Hextall prefers a little bit of wiggle room when it comes to the salary cap. It's nice to have cap space, I can tell you that much, but that's something kind of getting in their way a little bit. They may not exactly be. It's something where they've learned that putting themselves in salary cap hell like they did under Paul Holmgren didn't exactly work out. So it's something where that's another factor to it as well. And you have the rebuild, which is coming along very nicely, and obviously it will come time to pay these guys and pay them exactly what they're worth. But that's the time that's going to come, and it's a bridge that'll be crossed when they get there.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong here. there's a difference between being a playoff team and being a team that's in win now mode. Because win now teams, and these are the teams you see like what Washington did at the trade deadline, things like that. They're the teams you see making all the moves that they feel like they need to make in order to win in the immediate. It's what they have to do to get it done that year, and a lot of times it doesn't always pan out that way. What the Flyers are doing, I don't think anything about this past offseason screams win now, obviously. They're a rebuilding team. We kind of established that. But at the same time, I don't think they've done anything this past offseason that takes away from their chances of being a playoff team next year either. I think it's as good. I think the odds of them being a playoff team are just as good as them not being a playoff team because they're right on the in-between. They're going to have younger players, potentially with more talent than the players they've had to try to utilize over the last few years. So we'll see how it goes. You know, they're far from being a true contender, you know, up against the ranks of everybody else. But let's get down to it when it comes to October and see everybody on the ice at the same time. You know, let's put it this way. Imagine the Flyers coming in with all the players that we think they're going to have on the roster on opening night. Get to the home opener. The home opener is instantly against a team like Washington. Look at the schedule the Flyers have right out of the gate. That'll tell you if this team is ready to go or not. And, you know, it's a rough time to have the growing pains because you're going to have players who don't have a lot of experience. In fact, some with none coming in. But that'll be the time that shows you what these players are made of because they're going to have to make the adjustment very quickly. And they might have a bad game in the first game or the second game, you know, in San Jose, in Los Angeles, maybe, you know, in Anaheim or in Nashville. But maybe by the time they come back and have played 4 games and you know, maybe they can put it all together for one game against a team like Washington and you get a win out of that and you start to see everything turning around a little bit. That's what'll make this team a contender or at least a potential playoff team is how they respond to it. You know, the way Ivan Provorov responded to adversity early in the year and the growing pains early in the year to embrace the number one role by the end of the year, that's what the Flyers need from these kids. And if anybody who is new to this team in the 2017-18 season responds to it the way that Provorov did with the increased ice time and the increased role, or even the way Konechny did in having to deal with an injury and benching in his rookie season. If you can respond to all of that and take it in stride and really try to build off of that and gain momentum from that and become motivated by that, then the Flyers are going to be in a really good position in the years down the road if they can just be a team that hangs in the picture this season. And that's going to do it for this episode of the Flyerdelphia podcast. We want to thank everyone for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and Google Play and subscribe to our YouTube channel. So next week being the final show we will have in the month of August, we will put a wrap on the offseason, looking back at all the moves made during the last few months as training camp and the preseason are preparing to begin in September. So once again, thanks for listening. For Rob Riches and Dan Heaning, I'm Kevin Durso, and this has been the Flyerdelphia podcast on SportsTalkPhilly.com.
This has been another edition of the Flyerdelphia podcast with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heaning, presented by SportsTalkPhilly.com.